Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for attending our session on measuring biodiversity progress and impact, exploring the 3-30-300 rule and science-based approaches. My name is Cara Horner. I'm one of the senior professional officers here at ICLEI Oceania, and I'll be your webinar host today. If you've got any questions as we progress through the webinar, please pop them into the question and answer box. Now, I thought we'd just start with a quick poll to get us started. So if you could tell us which region you are joining us from, that would be wonderful. So hopefully that will pop up for you in just a moment. Okay, we'll give you 30 seconds for that. Love to see where you're from. Okay, that shouldn't be a moment. I need some waiting room music here. All right, 5 more seconds to just answer that quick poll. Okay, and we've got mostly from Oceania, some from Asia, and a few from Europe at the moment. Fantastic. Okay. Thank you very much, everybody, for telling us where you're joining from. So, the inclusion of a whole of government approach within the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, or GBF, emphasises the critical need for political will and comprehensive recognition across all levels of government. Local and subnational governments play a pivotal role in biodiversity conservation and the sustainable use of resources. As the closest level of government to communities and ecosystems, councils are uniquely positioned to address the opportunities and challenges for systemic change within their mandates and management. The Convention on Biological Diversity, or CBD, supports the involvement of subnational and local governments in shaping mechanisms for planning, monitoring, reporting and review. Local and subnational governments are invited, on a voluntary basis through Decision 15.6, to contribute commitments that support national biodiversity strategies and action plans, as well as the GBF, and to share these commitments through CBD recognised online platforms. The COP16 resume session, occurring in Rome this week from the 25th to the 27th of February, will shape how progress towards the GBF implementation is reviewed at COP17. The monitoring framework to be discussed will play a central role in this process as it sets common standards for measuring progress against the 23 targets. Additionally, the agenda will consider the inclusion of commitments from non-state actors, including subnational governments. In this context, it's crucial to address urban biodiversity metrics and target setting, which are vital for measuring and reporting on the contributions of subnational and local governments to the GBF and the Nature Positive agenda. Now, today we have two amazing speakers joining us to explore the vital role of local governments in addressing biodiversity challenges and driving systemic change, and how they can advance the GBF through science-based approaches. Firstly, we have Ingrid Coetzee, the Director of Biodiversity, Nature and Health, ICLEI Africa and Global Cities Biodiversity Centre, and she'll be joining us from South Africa via video recording. Now, we've got Dr. Thami Croeser. Now, Thami is an urban planner at the RMIT University Centre for Urban Research in Melbourne, Australia, with a specialist focus on planning for urban greening. Thami's research and advocacy focuses on using geospatial mapping techniques to demonstrate how our cities can bring back nature at scale into the places that we live and work. Also joining us today are Amanda Stone and Jade Sullivan. Now, Amanda is the ICLEI Oceania Board Chair and former advisor to ICLEI on nature, biodiversity and ecosystem restoration. Until recently, Amanda was a councillor at the City of Yarra Council in the inner northern suburbs of Melbourne, where she championed action on climate, biodiversity and social justice. Amanda attended COP15 in Montreal, where the GBF was adopted, and has presented in numerous forums on nature and biodiversity for ICLEI. And last but not least, Jade Sullivan is ICLEI Africa's Professional Officer for Biodiversity, Nature and Health, and will be representing Ingrid during question time at the end. Now I will hand over to Amanda for the acknowledgement of country.
Thank you, Cara. We have people joining us from everywhere today, but I'm joining this webinar from Wurundjeri country in Melbourne, and I acknowledge the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people as the traditional owners of this land. And I also recognise the traditional owners of the countries which you're all joining us from today, from whom we still have so much to learn about caring for the land and the waters, about protecting biodiversity and restoring ecosystem. So I pay respect to elders who are here today and to elders past, present and emerging, and with you celebrate the diversity of traditional custodians and their cultures and connections to land and water across the globe. My great pleasure is to introduce our first speaker today, which, as Cara has said, is Ingrid Coetzee. She's the Director of Biodiversity, Nature and Health at ICLEI Africa and also of the Global Cities Biodiversity Centre. Now, Ingrid is on her way to this resumed Biodiversity COP16 in Rome, and she's had a delayed flight. So she's going to be joining us at the moment via video recording. But if she gets off the flight and through customs later in time, she will join us for the discussion towards the end of the webinar, and I hope she does. So let's hear from Ingrid.
Good day. I'm Ingrid Coetzee from the ICLEI Cities Biodiversity Centre. I've been asked to present the global policy landscape for biodiversity in cities in this webinar on measuring biodiversity progress and impacts. I will be talking a bit about the mandate for cities under the Convention of Biological Diversity, and I'll also touch on the biodiversity monitoring and reporting tools that are available for cities and regional governments. And then I will highlight some of the initiatives under related conventions on wetlands and migratory species, and we'll conclude with some opportunities for cities in terms of taking action and measuring progress on biodiversity. The defining global policy for biodiversity is the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, the GBF, which was adopted by the parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity in Montreal in December 2022. A key element of this GBF is its emphasis on whole of government or multi-level governance and whole of society approaches in reaching the 4 goals and 23 action-oriented targets. On the slide, I've highlighted some of these targets. The most important one relevant to cities is Target 12. Now, Target 12 is the first target specifically directed to cities that has been included in a Rio Convention. And it urges the increase in size, in area, in quality, in connectivity of green and blue urban spaces, and also addresses the issue of improved access and benefit from such spaces. Target 14 speaks to mainstreaming biodiversity in urban planning processes. Target 7 around the reduction of pollution sources, and this is obviously an important thing for cities as well. And then there are the so-called 30 by 30 targets, which address ecological restoration, as well as biodiversity conservation at an area-based level. In addition to the recognition that we find in the Global Biodiversity Framework of the importance of local and subnational governments and multi-level governance, we also find that the CBD has around 30 other decisions that recognize the role that cities and regions play in implementing the objectives of both the Convention as well as the Global Biodiversity Framework. The first of these decisions stems from 2008. And then in 2010, we saw the first dedicated local and subnational government decision being adopted at COP10 in Nagoya, Decision 1022. And this was then renewed at COP15 in Montreal with Decision 1512. So these two decisions are very significant because it makes the CBD the only Rio Convention that has a mechanism for local government engagement or multi-level governance, and also includes a comprehensive plan of action for the decade that guides and directs the contribution that local and subnational governments will make towards global biodiversity targets. In other words, those decisions provide the mandate for engaging local and subnational governments, and also recognizes the ambition that they have in contributing to biodiversity conservation targets. Now, Decision 1512 specifically also recognizes that local and subnational governments are a constituent part of many parties and of governments, and that the implementation and monitoring of the GBF needs to involve all levels of government as appropriate. And secondly, that the important role of local and subnational governments in the implementation of the Convention, as well as many of the means of implementation to achieve these global biodiversity framework objectives and targets. So the decision 1512 is a whole lot more ambitious than the first dedicated decision of COP10, and it again repeats the or renews the multi-level governance, and that consists of advisory committees. So there's an advisory committee for local governments, and there's another advisory committee for subnational governments. And these advisory committees provide the direct link between the political representation of local and subnational governments to the executive secretary. And the idea of these committees is that they will advise and provide input to the Convention on how the plan of action is being implemented, what the perspectives and positions of local and subnational governments are, and what the progress is being made in terms of the plans of action that have been adopted under the Decision 1512. The other thing that is important about this decision is that it also defines the focus and the content of local and subnational government engagement in enhancing the implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework, providing a decade and very comprehensive plan of action, which consists of 7 interconnected action areas. And these include specific contributions and roles made by cities and subnational governments in the national biodiversity strategies and action plans, in collaboration and mainstreaming of biodiversity resource mobilization, capacity development, communication, education and awareness raising, assessment and improved information for decision making, monitoring and reporting, which I will come back to a little later. The other important thing about this decision is that it actually includes the contributions and the progress made by local and subnational governments in the midterm review of the Global Biodiversity Framework, in that it specifically requests the Executive Secretary to undertake a review of the role that cities and subnational governments have played in achieving the Global Biodiversity Framework, as well as the Convention, and this report on that will be tabled at the 17th Conference of Parties. COP16 adopted several decisions that are relevant to cities and subnational government. The slide lists these, but I want to just focus on a few. For example, the decision on invasive alien species, which specifies targeted action by cities and regions. The milestone decision on biodiversity and climate change, which calls for a whole of government, whole of society approach. The decision on biodiversity and health, which references local and subnational governments in the Global Plan of Action. And the decision on wild species, which also recognizes that action is required at all levels of government. COP16 had to be suspended due to a lack of quorum and is convening in Rome this week to finalize its negotiations. The key decisions to be finalized and adopted are listed on the slide. Given the strong recognition in Decision 1512 to the role of local and subnational governments in monitoring and reporting, the finalization of the decisions on the monitoring framework and on planning, monitoring, reporting and review mechanism are important to local and subnational governments. When these decisions are finalized, we will have clarity on indicators for measurements, on the tools, on the reporting templates, and on the review process. Regarding cities and regions' contributions to the GBF, cities with nature and regions with nature are important and established global monitoring and reporting platforms. These are partnership initiatives that recognize and enhance the value of nature at the urban and landscape or territorial levels. These two sister platforms are endorsed in CBD Decision 1512, which encourages subnational governments and cities to use both regions of nature and cities with nature to report on and track progress against their commitments to the implementation of the GBF, as well as national biodiversity strategies and action platforms. Furthermore, these platforms provide a tool to include contributions made by cities and subnational governments in the national reports under the Convention, and they help coordinate the contributions of these local and subnational governments towards the midterm review that is on the implementation of measures to mainstream biodiversity. Now, the Cities with Nature Action Platform has been designed to meet the monitoring and reporting requirements in Decision 1512. And this action platform is aligned with the Global Biodiversity 2030 action targets. And it's been designed in a way that interprets the global targets into actions and commitments that are relevant to local government mandates and functions. It encourages cities to set their own targets and to use the CBD endorsed Cities Biodiversity Index to set baselines for these targets. This slide includes some screenshots from the Cities with Nature Action Platform to illustrate what it looks like and how cities are using it. Now, in line with the GBF targets, cities can choose to take action and make commitments towards protecting and restoring nature and/or the sustainable use of nature and/or developing tools and solutions that will contribute to the GBF targets. The image on the left shows that the city of Glasgow in Scotland has captured 32 actions towards protecting and restoring nature. Of these 32 actions, one of their commitments relates to increasing the extent of areas in the city that are conserved through other effective area-based conservation measures, or OECMs. And in the image on the right, we see how the Waterberg District Municipality in South Africa has used the city's biodiversity index to help it set baselines to inform the actions it will take and the commitments it will make in contributing to the GBF. The Berlin Urban Nature Pact, which has been spearheaded by the City of Berlin in collaboration with ICLEI, is a pact by cities for cities that seek to halt and reverse biodiversity loss and put nature on a path to recovery for the benefit of people and planet by 2030. The pact builds on the 2020 Edinburgh Declaration and the 2022 Montreal Pledge, and it focuses on contributing to the implementation of the GBF and the Plan of Action in CBD Decision 1512 through a set of SMART targets. The Berlin Pact is accompanied by 6 implementation principles that will safeguard the implementation of the Pact targets. These principles are reflected on the slide and relate to monitoring and reporting, equal and just co-creation with local initiatives and stakeholders, stepwise implementation, capacity building and collaboration of cities, commitment to action and ambition, and finally, to linking and enhancing policy and governance frameworks and financing for biodiversity. In addition, the Berlin Pact sets out 7 target areas that translate the CBD Decision 1512 Plan of Action into ambitious and measurable targets. These cover the following topics: green infrastructure and trees, blue infrastructure and water management, food and agriculture, education and nature experience, soil health, cohabitation, and species and habitats. These 7 target areas comprise of the 28 SMART targets, and signatories to the Berlin Urban Nature Pact must commit to a minimum of the 15 targets. Following a very comprehensive and long consultation process to develop the Berlin Urban Nature Pact, the pact has to date been signed by the City of Berlin in Germany, Austin in the USA, Cali in Colombia, Utrecht in the Netherlands, and eThekwini in South Africa. Several other cities around the world are in progress of signing the pact or else showing strong interest to sign the pact. Another important tool for measuring biodiversity is the city's biodiversity index. This index, also known as the Singapore Index on Cities Biodiversity, is a self-assessment tool recognized by the CBD for cities to evaluate and monitor the progress of their biodiversity conservation efforts against their own individual baselines. It is a scientifically defined tool that includes 28 indicators, and on the left of the slide you can see the list of these indicators. These include a range of things such as measuring native biodiversity, ecosystem services, governance and institutional capacity, the state of capital assets in the city, as well as things such as education, awareness, community science, etc. The CBI handbook, as well as its assessment calculator, has been digitized and included in the Cities with Nature platform. Now, the image on the right hand shows the digital version, which is embedded, as I said, on Cities with Nature platform. And you can also see that it has been translated into several languages. This includes Portuguese, Spanish, French, and Korean. And in one of my earlier slides, I showed how a city in South Africa has applied this index in developing its own baselines. Other initiatives for cities and regions to contribute to biodiversity conservation are the Wetland City Accreditation Scheme under the Ramsar Convention and Journeys for Life, which encourages cities to contribute to the Convention on Migratory Species. Now, while these two initiatives are not biodiversity measuring tool initiatives, they do encourage action at the local level that is measured through contributions by cities to the Cities with Nature Action Platform. The Wetland City Accreditation Scheme encourages cities to apply for accreditation by taking measures that will protect and manage wetlands. These can either be urban wetlands or wetlands within the area of the city's jurisdiction, or even beyond its jurisdiction, as long as the city depends on that wetlands. And the Journeys for Life initiative is an initiative that fosters collaboration and twinning between cities located along migratory routes to enhance ecological connectivity, habitat restoration, and encourage the integration of migratory species into urban planning. To conclude, cities can contribute to global and national biodiversity targets and measure their progress against local actions by joining Cities with Nature and making commitments on the action platform, by measuring the impact of implementation projects that contribute to the GBF targets, also measuring the impact of mainstreaming biodiversity into land use and spatial plans, using existing indices and matrices to establish baselines and set targets, such as the Cities Biodiversity Index or the Berlin Urban Nature Pact, aligning priorities and actions to national biodiversity strategies and action plans, and ensuring that their contributions to local action and commitments are included in national reports to the CBD. Thank you, and if anybody would like to have some more information, I've included my email address, and my colleague Jade Sullivan is in the webinar today and she's able to field any questions. We've also provided a link to some valuable resources.
Wow, such a wealth of knowledge from Ingrid there. Hopefully COP16 version 2 will make a quorum in the next couple of days and yield some results. So fingers crossed for that. Now, it's my absolute pleasure to invite our next speaker, Dr. Thami Croeser from RMIT Centre for Urban Research, to take over the screens. So Thami, welcome and thank you for joining us today.
Good afternoon, everybody, and just my greetings from Melbourne, which is also unceded sovereign Wurundjeri land. So let's see how these slides are moving. There's a slight lag on the slide changes at the moment. Are they moving? Still nothing? Okay, there's a bit of movement. I might pass to Cara, but I'm going to try for now to do this. So let's talk about this thing, the 330-300 rule, because it's a really quite powerful metric that may be quite well aligned with your work if you're interested in delivering some of the stuff that Ingrid has just spoken about. But it's also quite a promising progression in how we measure the provision of nature in our cities. So I've just completed a quite significant study on that at the end of last year. So I'm going to tell you what this metric is. I'm going to tell you why it's interesting. I'm going to give you some results from the study that we've just completed. And then you'll notice the first part of that presentation isn't very biodiversity focused, we're going to shift a little bit and talk about how this could work in an alignment with those biodiversity metrics. So let's jump into it. I'm going to try the slide clicker one more time. There it is. Okay, beautiful. So what is 330-300? Let's start from the beginning. It's a test for every building in a city. And the idea is that your building, whether it's a workplace, a home, a school, should pass this test. And it's 3 simple, easy to understand tests, effectively, subtests, you could call them. Can you see 3 trees from your house? Do you have 30% canopy in your neighborhood? Not, 5 kilometers down the road, in your local neighborhood. And importantly, is it 300 meters or less for you to get to a local park? And that is presented not as a metric necessarily where you're just kind of seeing how you're going. It's actually a minimum standard. That's what sets it apart in some ways. It is proposed as a minimum standard for human well-being, for nature provision. So that was something that didn't come from nowhere. It came from quite an influential academic. This is Cecil Konijnendijk, professor of urban forestry. He went out and did a big review of what is required in terms of human access to nature. So there's actually been a lot of really good scholarship in the last 20 years or so around what nature does for us. And he proposed this not as a perfect scientific measure of exactly how much everyone will need in exactly every city, but something that is a rule of thumb that is easily translatable, generally will be enough for most people in most cities. And he wanted it to be really easy to understand. The way he actually talks about it is, I composed it so it would rhyme. And that has some power. We are seeing significant uptake of the rule, and it does have that simple punchiness to it. When I came across it, I was working in Europe a little bit, and all the Europeans I ran into were already talking about it. This was a couple of years back. It's starting to come here to Australia, but it's only been the last couple of years that this metric came about. So the strengths I saw in it are these. Firstly, it's really quite a nice clear benchmark. Some cities have a canopy target of 25% or 30% or 41%, whatever it is. This is a benchmark that actually is linked to a threshold. It's presented as that minimum standard. I like that a lot. It's also really easy to understand, and particularly it's easy to understand for executives and politicians and members of the community. Those are all very politically important people who need to get that we need to have enough nature in our cities, right? It's evidence-based to the extent that any heuristic can be. It's really come out of that big review of evidence around human well-being in cities. And it gets around aggregation, which is to say, if there is a park a few kilometers down the street, it doesn't actually count in your neighborhood. You don't pass if that's way down the road. And to illustrate that, I'll just give you a really quick example of what that looks like. So this is Cairns. This is a city in the north of Queensland, and it's got an excellent overall canopy number. I think it's around 50% overall canopy in the city of Cairns municipality. However, if you see that red box, that's actually where a lot of the activity in Cairns is. That's kind of their downtown area. They don't have much greenery in there at all if you look closely. But if you were to look at it overall, you'd say, well, Cairns has got 50% canopy, it's fine. Whereas in fact, that area is almost a complete wasteland. If you are any living creature or even a human being who's just trying to walk down the street without sweating. More localized metrics are powerful in this regard, and 330-300 is really useful in that way. Linking to Ingrid's presentation as well, this is, what a set of the Berlin Pact targets. She mentioned that there's the green infrastructure smart targets. This is what those handful of cities have already committed to. If you're hitting 330-300, you're meeting human needs, but you are also probably going to be doing quite well on your Berlin Pact targets. Look at that, 4.1. 1 tree for every 6 residents. You'll exceed that with 330-300. 4.2, 10% or more canopy cover. Again, you're kind of passing that. And 4.4, looking at access, walkable access to parks. They want 500 in this one. So 300, you're really going to be doing well. There's other things that are quite useful as well, which I think are quite valuable. But 330-300 is all about simplicity and ease initially, and that has its power. So when I got excited about this, I started trawling for data because I'm a geospatial analyst partly. And I started with my own city, and I figured out a set of analytics that could test every single building in Melbourne. 43, 30, 300. And you can see the result on the left. I've just presented as a very simple overall score. And what you see there is red buildings, that bottom scale, red buildings have failed all 3 tests. Dark green buildings, there's hardly any, have passed all 3 tests. And there's lots of orange and light green, which means you've kind of passed 1 or 2 tests. You maybe got the 3 trees, or you've got the parks, but you don't have the other things, right? And I've broken it down in the other 3 images that you can see. So you can see which tests were passed and failed with a simple green-red binary. 30% canopy, almost no one had it in our inner city neighborhoods. That's quite striking. Better access to parks, but kind of a little bit half and half. And then views to trees, we actually had reasonably good numbers of buildings with views to trees in Melbourne. So one of the great things about analytics and data is once you've built that analytical process, then you can feed new data into it and get interesting new results. And it took me a long time to dig up data from around the world, but I started finding cool things. So for example, here is Buenos Aires. Sorry, I'll go one back. Gosh, sorry, can we go back to Buenos Aires? There we are, good. This is an example. This is a bit of an awkward system, sorry guys. You'll see in a moment this
There it is
slide for
now.
Buenos
You're
Aires.
right,
There it
Thami,
is.
now.
Thank you, Cara. All right, great. You can see a whole city, individual buildings with the test. We've just done it for the 300-meter test. And you can see those blue rings, which represent buildings that have access to parks within 300 meters, orange buildings that do not have that access. And we scaled that up and we did it for 8 cities around the world. And I'm going to show you those now. So you can see there's 3 columns, 3, 30, and 300. Those correspond to the 3 tests, blue being a pass, orange being a fail. And you can see with the 3, lots of buildings actually did quite well. They had the views to 3 trees, you know, at least half in most cities. Denver, not so great, but New York, Seattle, really high rates of views to trees. But what we found really striking across all of the cities we looked at, I did 8, so I'll show you another 4 soon. But with these ones in particular, you sort of saw good views to trees, but not great canopy results, you know. Very few buildings actually had the neighborhood canopy, even though they had the views to the trees. Then on the right column, you can see those sort of blue rings around where your parks would be. Those are your park accessible buildings. Those were often quite mixed. And it was similar when we looked at some of the other cities that I did. So Sydney, Melbourne, Buenos Aires, and Singapore. Lots of views to trees, not great canopy results. So that was, I think, probably one of our biggest stories from the study. Singapore, for many of you, won't be that surprising as the outlier. We used quite sort of generous canopy data on that one. That tends to slightly overestimate canopy, but even then, it's quite a tough test to pass. In Singapore, 75% of buildings had passed the canopy. So quite a standout result there. But most places had pretty average canopy, pretty good views to trees, and pretty middling access to parks. So let's talk about the results. Let's talk about what that would mean from a practical sense if you're actually trying to prioritize how much nature access you want to provide in an urban area. So what we can see here is the center of Denver. And what we've got is a scoring protocol where I've just taken it down to the bare minimum of have you passed each of the tests? 0 being yellow, you know, you haven't passed any tests, purple being you've passed all 3. And you can see it's quite rough and binary. There's lots of buildings that are completely failing. There's a handful that completely pass. But the thing about this test is it's very strict. So if you've got 28% canopy in your neighborhood, you fail. So you might be one of those yellow buildings. So we looked at a way of taking it and making it a little bit more compensatory, a bit more balanced, and making it a score out of 10. So if you've got 3, 30, 300, you get 10 out of 10. If you've come close, you might get 7 or 8 out of 10. And if you're missing those things by quite far, you might be at 1 or 2 out of 10. And there you can see the graded scoring out of 10. It's much more nuanced. And suddenly you can start really picking out where things are almost there, where maybe small investments would work well. You can see areas which are really falling quite far short and get some nuance and difference in that. And one of the main reasons I'm showing this to you is because I wanted to show you what the streets look like. So I went into Street View. I've never been to Denver, but I found some streets that were doing really well, some that were doing very average, and some that were doing completely terribly, 0 out of 10. And I wanted to show you what they look like because it was quite a striking finding for me. Let's start with the 0, which will come up in just a moment. There it is. All right, so that's a 0 out of 10 street. Not very surprising. Concrete and asphalt everywhere. That would be a nightmare in a heat wave, and certainly for recreation, also quite unpleasant. No surprises there. And similarly, the 10 out of 10, which you'll see in a sec, not very surprising. You've got really big, healthy trees, and you've got lots of them down the street. Makes sense. There's also a park within a few hundred, I think maybe 60 meters of this particular point, which we looked at. So 10 out of 10, you passed everything. What wowed me was this third one, which was a 5 out of 10 score. I know we're joining from all over the world, but I walk down streets all the time that look like this, and they look quite normal to me. But this is only a 5 out of 10. Now, this is supposed to be a minimum standard for human well-being. So imagine your doctor had got 5 out of 10 on their medical exams, that kind of thing. It's not great. It's actually falling quite far short on meeting needs in terms of access to nature, and yet it's so normal for us. This is quite an important finding because normal for us might not actually be adequate for nature. So going onwards, let's step through the headlines of the study, and then we can talk a little bit more about the biodiversity aspects and some of the data in behind it. But firstly, big headline, we are badly under-providing crucial infrastructure. Even some of the greatest cities in the world do not pass 330, 300, which means we're not really ready for heat waves. We're not looking after our populations as well as we could. But, there's a but. We have enough trees in many places to meet the 3 standard. So it seems like our streets have got the trees. So, it's a big so, tree health and retention are probably not getting enough attention. So if you've got the trees, like that 5 out of 10 street in Denver, which were kind of maybe a little bit taller than me, pretty unhealthy looking trees, you're not going to pass this test. And similarly, if you've got 1 or 2 trees, you're not going to pass the test. But the other thing is, if your tree population is turning over a lot because you're removing them regularly rather than letting them grow really big, you're going to have the 3 test passed, but not the 30. Very important focus on big, healthy old trees, not just any tree, right? But there's something else as well. 3 trees may be enough for review. I don't necessarily think it's always enough for canopy. So planting densities of 3, this is what happens when you come with a new index. It may actually be that you need a little bit more in some areas. 3 might not be enough to nail it. But let's go to the big one. And this, I think, was something I hinted at with those street view images. Conventional urban design, what looks normal to us, what feels normal to us, actually might not be good enough for us in terms of our needs, in terms of access to nature. Reflect on that a moment and then think about, well, probably it's similar for biodiversity as well. So summary of that, insights from that study, which we published in Nature. It's open access, by the way. You can go and find that on your own terms if you want to. Just Google me, I think, and it'll probably come up. It's open and free. But the takeaways are, this is a minimum standard. It's got some merit as a minimum standard, but just planting trees is not going to get you out of it. You actually need to have the big healthy trees. And the big thing is that norm of, if our streets keep being designed really as mainly places for cars, we're not going to meet that nature access standard. Now, I've been talking a lot, so how about we take a moment to do a poll? Team, could we pop that up? So this is a poll looking at the kind of ingredients that you need for 330, 300, and you can see there's 5. So tick as many as you want, because what I found was often cities have 2 or 3. Some cities have 5. It was a big search. I'll leave this up just for 30 seconds more or so, and then let's see how much data we have. And it's okay if you don't know. Give it a guess. Ready to see how we went?
I'll end the poll now, Thami.
Thanks, Kara. Wow. Okay. This is really promising. Honestly, when I went online searching a year ago on open databases, I certainly didn't have this level of cover. So I guess the takeaway is that a lot of people have a lot of the useful resources here. They just might be internal resources within councils. And look, if you've got these things, you can probably calculate 330-300, and the recommendations I'm going to give you now will reflect that a little bit, that maybe this is a audience that actually has pretty strong capacity to do this stuff. But if you said no to all 5 or just 3 or whatever, that's okay. There's also an avenue for you that I'll be talking you through. So let's jump to a discussion of this metric. Is this the right metric for you? Look, it has those benefits that I've talked about. It's really clear. Your boss's boss's boss will get it. Your uncle at the barbecue will get it. And it's got a good evidence base behind it. And it deals with that aggregation issue, which really can otherwise be very confusing in some cities like the one in Cairns. However, you'll notice I haven't said biodiversity much, and it's the same with heat and flooding. It does not necessarily, whoops, sorry, overshoot. It does not necessarily actually tackle those in a direct way, which might not bother you. Some people it does bother. It's also not clearly linked to action. So in some cases, people feel quite discouraged when their city fails it quite badly. It doesn't necessarily show you what you need to do in a clear, easy to access way. The methods can be a bit fuzzy. I had to make some judgment calls on my calculations. They are robust. They went through peer review. Other people have taken other methods, which mean that you can get slightly variable results. It's still pretty solid, but there's a fuzziness. And lastly, the people who change cities a lot, your real estate markets, disaster risk management, engineering standards, laws, it's getting popular in urban forestry circles, in urban greening circles, not necessarily in those circles yet, but it could infiltrate them. So what should we do? If you're a biodiversity person and you're really looking to hit some of those standards, you're really looking to not just deliver for humanity, Cecil looked only at human well-being standards, but you also want to deliver for your local nature. 330-300 has some merit, but not the complete package. That would be my conclusion. So we're doing another study at the moment on what specifically, if you had to do a biodiversity metric for streets, would look like, and what kind of things you'd measure. And we came up with these 4 things: structural resources, vegetation, understory, canopy, bushiness, that kind of stuff that insects, birds, animals need. Species diversity. You can't just have monocultures, and yet you walk down some of our streets and it's just one species of tree or just one species of understory. That doesn't work that well. Nativeness is also great. Native species in particular tend to do better, and you see more of them if you've got more native things that they've adapted to in their region. 330-300 does not factor that stuff at all. But connectivity, where you actually have stepping stones between your big patches of habitat, so you don't just have those little fragments. In some ways, 330-300 demands localness of your green infrastructure, and both with its park metric, the views to trees, and well, actually all 3 really, neighborhood canopy. It has some value there that other metrics, just like overall canopy or just how much tree you're planting, those don't. So 330-300 has some stuff you can leverage, certainly there. So I'll just give you a quick glimpse of what the future might look like in this area. I'm currently walking down streets, filling out forms manually. We haven't developed a geospatial method for doing these tests for streets, but it might be down the track that you actually have a score out of 100 across those 4 areas: structure, diversity, nativeness, and connectivity. We're developing those tests. We're looking to publish that this year, and that methodology, but it'll be a while before I can, feed satellite data into a bit of code and spit out results for every street in your city. But the dream is that will be coming soon. But when I say soon, I mean in the next 2 to 3 years. So what could you do now with all the momentum and energy? And honestly, there's a bit of love for 330-300. What can you do with that right now in your city if you want to leverage that? I see 2 avenues. Now, I'm not a big text on slides guy, but I'm just going to read these ones out because I think this is the keeper. This is the takeaway. If you can do 330-300, I would suggest that you do it. Embrace it, but recognize that if you are really looking to get a biodiversity result, it's got some of the pieces, but not all of the pieces. So embrace it, use it to get the investment, use it to fill in the little the gaps for people, but at the same time, think about understory planting, think about the diversity of stuff that you're planting, and find your gaps in terms of habitat connectivity in your neighborhoods. And it looks like some of the Berlin Pact metrics could be very complementary in this way. So kind of go, let's do 330, 300, but let's graze some of these things from the Berlin Pact. You'll probably get an excellent result in your city. Option two, if you can't do 330, 300, or you think maybe you don't need that political buzz that it has, you're just in a place where you're actually free to just execute. You don't need that sort of political support. Just keep managing for canopy. Find your canopy shortage areas. Keep managing for park access for your populations, but then also focus on those other things, the understory, the diversity of your planting, and your connectivity between habitat patches. If you can do all of that and use things like citizen science or ecologists to monitor biodiversity change over time, I think you're pretty close to a gold standard. That's where I think things could go. And I believe that is it for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Thami. That was an amazing presentation. It was really wonderful to hear about your research, and your tips and pointers that you provided at the end, I think will really help councils with their work in this space. So I'm sure we'll have some questions at the end. Now, while the panel are just getting ready for some questions, I just wanted to mention these new Cities with Nature guides, which were just recently released a couple of weeks ago. And these 3 guides provide comprehensive information on nature for urban resilience, diverse values for valuation of nature for cities, and also biodiversity finance in your city. So make sure you check those out. We'll get Sharon to pop the link into the chat in a second for you, otherwise it's there on the screen. And also just a reminder for councils in the Oceania region that we do provide a range of nature and biodiversity support for councils. So this includes technical assistance and consultancy, Cities with Nature regional community of practice for the Oceania region, and also topic-based clusters of collaborative councils. So if you want to find out more, just reach out to us. Now, onto the questions. So we've got little under 10 minutes left to go before the webinar finishes up. However, I just thought we'd have a little bit of time towards the end here to go through some questions. Now, Amanda, I know that you're very passionate about this topic. Did you have a question for Thami or for Jade?
Oh, sorry, I can't. Oh, my video's off. So many questions, but there are also lots in the chat. So maybe just I've got lots for Thami, but maybe a quick one for Jade. Jade, the new global biodiversity framework has a role for multi-level governance, a partnership between all levels of government. But we know that it's got to be initiated by our national governments, who have the responsibility, obviously, to report on the goals and targets. Do you have any advice for local governments and subnational governments who actually want to take initiative and get these partnerships working and get into that space, rather than waiting for the national government to invite local governments, which, let's face it, is not going to happen in a lot of places? How can local governments get into this space, I guess, where they're working with their national government to meet these new global biodiversity framework targets as they can, because that's what they do?
So from our side, specifically on a global level, we are encouraging local governments to report to the global biodiversity framework using cities with nature and regions with nature. So what we are doing is, you'll know that in Decision 1512, both platforms were written into the GBF for the reporting. And we are actively working with the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, to take what the local governments are doing directly into the reporting system, so that the work that the local governments are doing is also recognized. And that's why we develop these platforms as mechanisms for the local governments to get involved and showcase the work that they are doing. So,
So they don't need to wait for their national government to invite them. If they report what they're doing on the Cities with Nature platform, it feeds straight into that UN process.
yes.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Thanks. That was a really good question, Amanda. Now, I've got a question here from a new local government officer, and it says, my experience so far in the role is that there is so much to do just getting the basics done, such as implementing small-scale projects, engaging with community and partners, etc. My concern is that reporting of global indicators appears to be a significant amount of work on top of biodiversity officers' already very busy schedules, including the State of the Environment report. Jade or Thami, did you want to comment on that?
I can comment. I've already sort of responded. I said that we are actively working at ICLEI to streamline this process. We have Cities with Nature. It has a section that focuses specifically on the Berlin Pact, where we've worked with the Berlin city to streamline the process for reporting. We have a digitized version of the city's biodiversity index. We are still trying to figure out how we can fill the one data in on the one side and have it feed to the other side, but we are getting there. And we also, as ICLEI Oceania and ICLEI CBC, are
exciting prospect of increasingly high-resolution geospatial data with more and more AI processing, which can start recognizing features in landscapes from long distances. So, you can use an aerial flyover and suddenly you can see things like not only tree canopy, but maybe even understory. And we're hopefully moving towards the point where even species identification can be done in an automated way using AI. Raises the prospect that, obviously this isn't much comfort right now, but down the track, it might be the kind of thing where a single national investment or even global investment in AI infrastructure and processing can just scan every building, scan a whole region and say, all right, here's all the results for each of France's buildings from a 330-300 aspect, or maybe from a biodiversity aspect as well. It won't always be perfect. You sometimes need field ecology, but that is maybe not too far off.
That would certainly be amazing, Thami. And look, they're already doing it with weeds, aren't they? So yes, we're starting to move in that direction. Now, I've got another question here, and Thami, I think this is probably for you. How can the 330-300 rule provide an objective, universal benchmark when every location has its own specific cultural history, landscape, and climate that determines its urban greening potential? Some places have a dry climate with not much water or sandy and fertile soils. How can they reach the target?
That's a great question, and I think I do try to emphasize this is a heuristic. So it is kind of a rule of thumb, which means you'll be getting close to what humans need. Now, if you are somewhere that's really coastal, really windswept, really low rainfall, sure, it will be more challenging. Being in a tropical place definitely helps. However, all our other life support systems, the water in our pipes, the electricity that keeps the lights on, all those other systems have been adapted to work in these environments. And indeed, you don't see a lot of environments where tree canopy is completely non-existent. So some of those things in those more challenging environments that might help are things like species selection in our landscapes. That's really helpful if you've got tough trees that are able to cope in a windy or low rainfall environment, but also changing how we engineer our landscapes a little bit so that particularly your gutters, your curb and channel drains, you catch water off those whenever it rains. So whatever limited rain comes off rooftops, off streets, everything is channeled into the soil near the trees that you've got. So they actually get multiplied levels of rainfall. So you kind of create these life support systems. And, some cities will actually go beyond that and invest in irrigation for their trees during dry periods, which has its pros and cons, but for some people it stacks up as well. So there's a few ideas on how you can meet these standards in more challenging environments.
Fabulous. Thank you, Thami. Now, look, I think we could probably stay here for the next half an hour answering questions, and perhaps that's a rookie error for not making the session long enough today. But look, we've certainly got a record of all the questions that are here. So what we will do is we'll actually write those questions down and put some answers to those and share them with everybody who's registered for today, so that we can make sure that we answer those questions, because some of them are really interesting, but we just haven't got the time to do that today, unfortunately. But look, I'd really just love to thank you all for attending today's session, and also Ingrid, Thami, Jade and Amanda for being part of our webinar, and also for Lou and Sharon for providing the tech support in the background. So thank you so much. And just on the screen there and also in the chat box is a survey for the session today. So if you've got a minute or so to just complete that for us, that would be incredibly helpful. And thank you so much for attending, and we hope that you enjoyed today's session, and that we'll see you again soon at an ICLEI webinar. Thank you so much.